I have to call.
Yes. Where are the jackets?
And make sure you
Alright, you guys got 4 speeches from your side? 4 speeches?
We have a 4 speech.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You want to be the only crossbench?
Is someone gonna?
I can do it.
I love 4 speeches. And they're fun.
Yeah, they're
Alright,
hilarious.
well, 1, 2 minute 4 speeches.
Cool.
We really want to do a cross, we do a short.
Actually, I didn't make sure we're
Everybody ready?
staying. Are we staying?
Alright, I now call this house to order. And welcome and congratulate both teams on making it to the final round of the congratulate the Providence College team. You guys have been an excellent tournament.
Here.
And you are officially better than the Providence College basketball team. And now call this house to order and call for the Honorable Prime Minister.
All right. Funsies all around. So, simple case statement. This House believes that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party should embrace the charter school movement.
Nope.
What is embracing the charter school movement?
Good question. So that would include things like lobbying congressional leaders, getting progressives or working to get progressives on specific committees within Congress, working with education think tanks, making public statements, like, yeah.
Cool. Can you tell me a little bit about the way that the current charter school movement works? And
Sure.
what charter schools are like?
Yeah.
I know that there's like a lot of variety.
Yeah, there's a lot of variety. Some are very good, some are very bad. Like, that is like just true, in case you didn't know.
Yeah.
Charter school movement has its roots back in the early 80s during the Reagan administration, like the very early roots of like finding alternative education initiatives. It was really pushed forward and pushed through initiatives like No Child Left Behind, initiatives like increased funding for charter schools both within state governments and within national government. We'd also say like state legislators should also do this too, like progressive Democrats in general.
Yes. I'm just understanding.
So that like there's been more funds for charter schools.
What are the rules that make charter schools?
So charter schools have a charter, which is something. No, that's important. So it means that they have something that they like a goal that they need to attain, and oftentimes in addition and including like the same state standardized testing scores that non-charter schools would also have, but they may have additional things in their charter. So a charter school can include things like an obligation to educate STEM over other things, like to have a STEM focus or to have a social justice focus, for example, or to have like a career path training focus like within their charter. But there's often like measurable benchmarks and goals that then the state can go back and then choose to either renew or not renew that charter at a point in time.
How are they funded?
They are funded through lots of different sources, sometimes private sources, sometimes public sources, and a lot of charter schools this functions like very differently state by state. Like in a lot of instances, there is a lot of state funding that the government like would directly provide to charter schools.
So in most instances, it's mostly public.
It's mostly public, but there is private funding as well, and like a lot of times that private funding may supplement something within the public, like the publicly funded charter school.
Do you have any questions, Steve? No, I think we're good.
Good? Cool. 3 reasons as to why the progressive wing of the Democratic Party should embrace the charter school movement. The first is that the charter school movement aligns with progressive goals. So charter schools are unique vehicles that allow students who are not being adequately served by the public school system to seek a better education. How is this the case? Students in areas that are socioeconomically disadvantaged are at a greater likelihood of not receiving a good education. This means that charter schools fill a vacuum when public schools cannot do things like support arts programs, give meaningful college preparation and guidance, or support skills-based training. So well-funded public schools in wealthy suburbs like where Matt Summers went to high school in Milburn, New Jersey, do have things like lots of arts programs, lots of sports teams and extracurricular activities to enrich people beyond like the state-mandated curriculum that they need to meet their benchmarks of testing scores. But unfortunately, schools only 20 miles away in Newark, New Jersey, for example, many public schools are not able to offer those alternative avenues of education that may be the one thing that spurs someone to like a college education or spurring someone to a future job that they might be successful at, beyond just the like math and science curriculums that are oftentimes tested by state curriculums. This means that progressives value, and we just think it's true, that progressives value helping marginalized individuals within society. That is like the number one goal of the progressive movement is to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. What we say on our side of the house is that when students in low-performing schools are not able to actively get the educational outcomes within the status quo that are successful for them, is that they need to embrace alternatives. So what we see on our side of the house is that charter schools help marginalized individuals at a greater rate than wealthy individuals. So, for example, people aren't leaving like Wellesley High to attend a charter school. They are leaving schools with soaring dropout rates in South Boston to attend charter schools. We say that charter schools enable individuals to have greater social choice within the future. They still have to meet their basic state standards when going to schools, such as taking tests or whatever like state metrics of education exist. But what we say on our side of the house is that the charter can be used as an alternative means of getting to positive educational outcomes. Often needs to prove how individuals that value social change can adequately get that through our current public schooling system, which disadvantages kids by geographic lines. Literally, the community where you live, if you live in Providence versus Cranston, like determines the outcomes of your educational future in many instances, or at least has a very great impact on your future chances. Progressives want to mitigate the lottery of birth when determining educational and economic outcomes, and supporting charter schools helps to mitigate the unfortunate realities of poverty. And that in many instances, charter schools are just simply higher performing, given that there is a very mandated amount of time where a 2 or 3 year period where the charter school needs to show demonstrated progress to the state and government entities. That means that there is some sort of metric that happens. On our side of the house, if a charter school is failing, it closes. On their side of the house, if a public school is failing, we throw more money at the problem, or we attempt to just cut programs from that school, which actively make that school an even worse place to attend. So the second point I want to talk about is that embracing the charter school movement is better for progressives. So progressives are currently marginalized within the political discourse of the United States. They cannot win elections, and when you make a progressive candidate does win an election, like Obama in 2008, appealed to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that candidate often moves away from progressive goals because they are not politically palatable. Ask any far left-wing Democrat, how they feel about Obama's policies, they say that they might support some things, but he hasn't done enough to do things for the most disadvantaged within society. He didn't do enough to implement aspects of the ACA that would have actually been incredibly helpful in eliminating the need to buy insurance, for example. He didn't close Guantanamo Bay. He didn't do a variety of things the progressive wing thought was very important. But the other very important part of this is the charter school movement is politically palatable. It is something that did start from Republicans. It started from Reagan, was pushed through forward by George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. That's a fact. The problem is the reality that we are living in is one in which the charter school movement is widely accepted as the right path to achieve educational attainment from the governmental power structures that exist within our legislature. We say that it's palatable because conservatives support the free market aspect of choice for students to attend the school that they think is best for them, for example, and that moderate liberals oftentimes credit charter schools like Harlem Success Academy for improving the educational outcomes of what in many cases are urban students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We see the progressive movement outweigh the benefits for staunchly supporting things like unions and teachers' rights with the benefits of students and our overall larger society for producing students that can succeed in college and can succeed with an increasingly competitive job market. We say on our side of the house is that yes, teachers are probably going to be pissed at the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Teachers' unions and some aspects of teacher labor in terms of tenure and other aspects of those programs may not have as much political support. We say that is fine, given that the comparative and the one in which teachers are gaining this level of support are able to continue to function in failing public schools, leaves kids behind, and makes it much harder for children to be successful in the classroom. We say that this doesn't mean abandoning teachers, but rather by not staunchly supporting teachers' union policies that do not help students. We say that progressives can enter the national discourse on this issue, and that many concerns with charter schools center on the issues of big corporate donors, for example, or private donors impacting the public funding or directly funding charter schools in some instances, such as Sam Walton or Bill Gates pumping millions of dollars into alternative education. Both of them have done that. So this means that progressives can work, number one, with these wealthy individuals to shape education policies and outcomes of schools that are funded by wealthy corporate donors. We say that there simply needs to be more money in education. There's not the political will to like tax individuals more, to like get more money in education. On our side of the house, we like by additionally encouraging private avenues of investment in education, we just put more dollars into the pool that can be spent in whatever way is seen fit to increase educational outcomes for students. We say on our side of the house that progressives can oppose these groups and offer viable alternatives if they are doing things that are so shitty over failing public schools. Sure, I'll take it away.
You can see that the problem is the local funding of education. Why shouldn't progressives campaign to end local funding of education and shift it to the state and federal level?
Like, I'm sorry, that's just not something that progressives are going to be able to shape in a debate that's going to be politically palatable for them. They will lose elections in the process. They will lose their even marginal influence within the political system if they choose to radically redistribute the tax system within our United States, like as it stands right now. Like, people hate talking about taxes. The progressive movement is not going to win hearts and minds and votes by talking about taxes. Third point, it allows for better educational solutions for students. Students simply have more choice in the charter school system. They do not have to opt into the charter school system funded by Sam Walton or like the Ayn Rand Institute if they choose not to. But progressives can help shape the charter process to ensure that schools are not ideologically shaping students in a detrimental way. Like, given that Republican affiliated groups are funding these schools, like we should have more Democratic affiliated groups also funding these schools to ensure that there is like viable educational outcomes that are not being like politically like sanitized or politically stigmatized in a certain way. We see that progressives are now just simply seen within our national rhetoric as pro-student instead of pro-teacher. That's something that can provide a distinct voice in the policy-making process. We say that income inequality and a lack of viable educational outcomes are bigger problems that need to be dealt with in our society, and that if the progressive movement values addressing these issues, they should align with the charter school movement. OPT needs to prove why we allow infinite choice for tertiary education, but why we should not allow greater choice for primary and secondary education. We say that progressives should support choice in all these instances and open up avenues for those who are most disadvantaged by embracing the charter school movement. We are proud to propose.
I am mystified that Gov ran a case where the opt to the case that beats it is in PMC. The primary problem with with education funding is that we do it on a massively local basis. So very rich zip codes get awesome schools because the tax money funnels from a very large tax base into one particular school, and in very poor districts, there's no money to fund the districts. So what would really solve this problem? We don't need to call for like radically higher taxes. What progressives can campaign on is keeping taxes the same, but moving it to more state-based funding. They're like, this'll never work. You'll never get the political support. So first of all, I don't know, not even having to raise taxes, but just doing this seems like something that those who are in the lower income spectrum, which is who progressives get to vote for them, is something that would rather appeal to them. We think states with overwhelming Democratic majorities will pioneer this technique. We would push for it in Washington, in Oregon, in Vermont, in California, in Connecticut. And then we would watch as these places get radically better outcomes for all of their poorest students, setting a very good precedent. But also, like, your alternative is to completely abandon something that the vast majority of the Democratic Party to move to something that the vast majority of the Democratic Party oppose, including most progressives in the status quo, and pissing off your biggest institutional ally. Why is that far less likely to succeed? It's not like the Republicans are going to vote for the pro-charter school Democrat, right? The fundamental problem on their side of the house. But then they get the second factor, which is the unions are going to fucking revolt. You know what? That's really shitty. We're in a post-Citizens United world, Mr. Speaker. There's devastating effects of money in politics, particularly at the state level, where they can totally subsume. In fact, in North Carolina, the Koch brothers effectively bought the entirety of the state legislature. Why is that incredibly important? There is one and only one Democratic Party check on that large institutional money. It's called unions, and they now fucking hate you on their side of the house. There's no way you're going to get progressive elect on their side of the house. You're just going to help bolster the pro-charter school Republican, because once the Democrats are for it too, I guess it must be really good. They're like, we'll get credit for it. No, the people who have been pushing it for 30 years are going to get credit for it. Insofar as that's the case, we can get radically more efficacy, way better outcomes, because let's say charter schools are pretty good. You know what's way better? Relatively equal funding of public schools. Like, even if they're like a little bit better, get a little bit more money, private investment, a little bit of flexibility, like, I don't know, twice the cash from all those rich districts flooding into those poor urban schools would do a lot better. I just trust you. Class sizes shrink from 40 students in class to 20 students in class, you'll get better educational outcomes. I trust you. Like, money doesn't solve everything, but it does solve the drastic problems we have in hollowed out urban education.
Sure.
Okay, so many urban public schools get large amounts of federal and state funding, even compared to moderately successful urban schools. Why are those schools still failing?
No, that's just look, so this is just a false statement, right? We have incredibly tiny amounts of federal funding in the status quo, mostly in small pilot programs that are under the discretion of the Secretary of Education, who gives out a small number of grants to maybe 5, 10 schools who meet certain criteria, race to the top as an example, right? But you hit maybe 2 states, 5 schools in each state. That is not substantial federal funding. And state funding is even more. So I come from Pennsylvania. I can use that as an example. Philadelphia gets maybe 5% of its school funding from the state of Pennsylvania. You know why? Because all the Republicans who elect the governor and all the Democrats who exist in Scranton don't really want to play for the poor black kids in Philadelphia. They don't like them very much. That's the fundamental problem. We can get the liberal states to change that reality. They don't create change on their side of the house. Second and point, actually, charter schools are really awful. Here's why. You're taking money from the public school system and reallocating it. Maybe it's true it gets matched so that $1 for every 4, $1 for every 5 gets matched by private sources. You're still taking $4 or $5 from the public school system and moving into the charter school system, which radically reduces results in the public schools. They're like, but the public schools are failing. Not for no reason. They're underfunded. You make the problem worse. But also, guess who gets to move to these charter schools? It's true, I know a lot of them operate on lottery basis and you have to apply. But you know who has the initiative to apply to these things? You know who will go through all the hoops and paperwork? You know who will think to leave their old school district? The most wealthy and elite individuals within these poor districts. So if you're a progressive, I've got a little theory. It's called the difference principle, and I think that you should help people who are the least well off first and foremost, because you should radically care about the notion behind the veil of ignorance. You would just prefer being the least well off because it would impede your ability to pursue a conception of the good. And if that's true, that thing would be really pernicious for their side of the house, because they get the worst off still stuck in the same schools, but with way less money, way worse education, a strict rights violation, we say, for every single kid who gets stuck in there. Because no, this is a matter of difference in degree, not kind. It is true that education might be bad on both sides of the house. Probably true. The American system's fucked up. But what we can get on our side of the house is substantially better education, at least to a degree, even if it still sucks, right, for these kids who are still in these urban districts, because they don't get hollowed out like they are on their side of the house. The kids who can't afford to take long transportation to the new charter school on the other, wealthier edge of town, etc. The ones who can't afford to stay in the extra long days that charter schools have because they need to work after school, right? These are the kids who won't benefit on their side of the house. We say as a progressive, engage in maximizing benefits to the least well. But finally, market failure. They're choice will solve everything. And once individual rational agents engage in the selection of schools, they'll solve all the problems in education. You know what you believe as a progressive? People aren't homo economicus and don't make strictly rational decisions. I don't know, my dad went to this high school and he played for the basketball team, so I'm not going to leave. I want to play for the basketball team on my own dad's kid. These are the sorts of decisions that kids and families will actually make. They aren't going to all move on mass just because their high school is bad. Particularly if they're not expecting to go in college in the first place. Because that's what 2/3 of America just doesn't, right? Given that's the case, they're not going to see it as a radical harm that they're not getting as well educated. But it really does hurt them. It really does hurt all of aggregate society over the long term on kids. First thing, they're it aligns with your goals. Yes, the free market goals of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They're you can seek better education if you're failed in the status quo, and that's really important. It's yes, and then everyone left behind is worse off, and also you impede the progress of the actual thing that would solve the education problem in the United States on your side of the house. They're we should value marginalized individuals. It's how are you doing that when you're howling out public school and investment? Right? Note that's not only from the state, but it's also from the relatively better off people who now leave from these schools, right? The sorts of people who might invest in after school clubs, like debate clubs. Don't do that anymore. So the ability for the debate club to pay for its poorest members because its better members can get paid for by their parents are kind of impeded on the other side of the house. They also get the lobbying on the other side of the house. The more politically efficacious parents are exactly the ones who get themselves into those charter school lotteries. But those are the parents who would show up to PTA meetings, would show up to their state legislator's office, or at least give them a call, and actually improve quality of education on our side of the house. They lose them. Then they're failure in the status quo, so we have to embrace alternatives. When something is failing, not every alternative is inherently better. This is a silly apple. They're we should value change. You're not going to get change in the status quo. A, I should give you a route to change off case. It's called lobbying for more state and federal funding proportionately. And secondly, yours is worse than the status quo. You don't win by default just because you pointed out that we're defending the status quo. It's called hopping. Then they're like, you're just going to throw money at the problem. We're going to close these schools. You know what happened in Chicago when they closed a shit ton of schools? Education results plummeted in the next few years. Admittedly, it's rather recent. We don't know the long-term aggregate effects, but I am relatively confident saying don't do something that has wrecked the Chicago education system under Rob Emanuel. Secondly, they're like better for progressives. Like, we can get, lots of progressives don't play Obama. It's probably because of Guantanamo and like drones. Then they're like, it's politically palatable. The GOP will get all of the credit. Then they're like, you have to weigh unions against other things. Yeah, I'm going to weigh them against losing all elections at the state level. Then they're like, more money's going to go in education. Yeah, but you're going to lose lots of money for the people who need it the most. They're like, there's no will for higher taxes. We don't need higher taxes. We need to reallocate the taxes. Then like, we get better educational solutions through choice. No, let's get them better educational solutions through state funding education. We're very comfortable with that.
He gives is actually a very toxic solution for the public school system to simply say that we can reallocate funding and suddenly transform the results of failing public schools. Because guess what? Most state constitutions and the way that states operate in terms of funding for schools is the most funding goes to the poorest schools in the status quo. It doesn't actually lead to educational outcomes that differ as a result of that funding. The problem isn't the funding, it's what's actually going on in the classroom as a result of that funding. So for instance, in my hometown, what they did with the local high school that was failing is they gave all the kids iPads, didn't do anything with them, and just reallocate funding, but don't do anything with that funding. Charter schools allow for a pioneering method of education that can then be translated back to the public schools. It allows for spaces where people feel comfortable experimenting in the classroom and in pioneering new forms of education. So look, his first point is like, what you need to do is you need to push for moving money in certain states. So I actually think this is just entirely wrong. He needed to warrant to you why funding dramatically is going to shift the outcomes of educational systems, rather than what we tell you, which is that actually the way you change public school systems and you change charter is introducing charter schools into the system that actually allow for people to have an option of escaping the public school system, which has been toxic to them for years. The other problem is the only benefits they can derive from this funding is like extremely long term. So the kids who are being hurt right now don't get any of the benefits because they don't have the opportunity to attend places like charter schools, so they're trapped into the failing public schools with the hope that maybe someday someone will pass a bill that might add some more funding, that might do something. But then I also think they talk about how like the unions are going to revolt, and that's terrible. So like I'm all for unions, but the teachers union is horseshit. Like the kind of stuff that the teachers union pushes for is basically basically a conglomerate that doesn't actually allow for a transformative approach to education, and instead just re-entrenches the same shitty stuff we've already been doing because we can't fire teachers, we can't actually evaluate what teachers are doing in the classroom, and it just does all of these things that don't actually transform the way individuals interact in the classroom or actually get education. But then he's like, Democrats will hate this. Okay, so Obama actually has endorsed public schools. Most Democrats actually think that Obama endorsed charter schools. Most Democrats actually think that charter schools are a very valid solution to a very systemic problem. And also I think the other problem is that progressives are currently alienated from dialogues about education because they refuse to engage with this proven solution to many of the problems within the educational system. So I think actually what happens is you get much more cooperation from many wings of the Democratic Party. As a result, please don't walk up to the podium. I don't know why you do that. Okay, so second point, charter schools are bad. I love this because I'm super psyched on charter schools. So basically he says we're just taking money from public schools and putting them into charter schools. Yeah, but it's not like we're like throwing the money out the window. Like we're reinvesting it in the very students who would have been in the public schools in the first place. So that's an insane point. But then also I think it's like not true that only the wealthiest students go to these charter schools. The wealthy students go to the private school. The poor students are then all left behind in the public school with no choice and no option to ever go anywhere else. So what happens actually is that most of the people in these communities are very not well off, but they have charter schools that are operating within their communities that they see on a daily basis, and they have officials in those schools who help people fill out the paperwork to apply to those schools. Harlem's success was started by someone from Harlem who realized that his public education had failed him, came back to the community, and reinvested in the community with a charter school. The reason charter schools are so much better than public schools is because it's the people from the community itself coming back to the community and creating these school systems. That's why charter schools have been especially transformative for individuals. But also recognize that like other charter schools are really beneficial as well because they target specific things that people need. So there are like charter schools for LGBTQ people in certain circumstances. There are charter schools for people There are charter schools for other individuals who also need STEM help. There are charter schools for people who are learning ESL. There are charter schools that are able to target specific educational issues and then help those individuals in a targeted fashion. The problem with public schools is not funding, but rather that they are not able to target to their students effectively. Charter schools allow for a space in which people can have physical separation from the toxicity of public school environments where the teachers do not have the ability to actually target to their communities. Recognize that most teachers aren't ESL or aren't able to teach individuals ESL, but in charter schools, they actually have the permission to use people who are able to teach their students in a very successful way. Then he's the people left behind are really going to lose out. But the problem is on their side of the house, everyone loses out. Just do some basic weighing, guys. Because if you do have people who leave, and he admits that everyone is losing out who stays behind, then he admits to some degree that people who leave are benefiting. So if we are going to benefit at least some students, I think that's far preferable than causing everyone to be trapped in the public school system. Moving on, Case. So the first argument is about how this aligns with progressive goals, but sure.
How do rich schools that aren't doing radical education techniques manage to produce such good educational outcomes?
Okay, so this is actually really interesting because it's not about the education itself, it's about structural issues of people having parents who have usually gone to college. It's not that wealthy schools are just wealthy, it's that the communities themselves have certain allowances. Recognize that it's very difficult to have a parent who's working multiple jobs, who will also probably may not speak English, and you are also trying to learn from them. It's very difficult to do so. So charter schools actually allow for people to have communities and spaces where they are able to learn successfully. But the other thing is oftentimes charter schools do really cool things like boarding schools. They allow people to exit communities that they were previously trapped in and go to other communities and stay at boarding schools and get out of those communities and actually inhabit a space that is safe for them. So yeah, it's not just that wealthy schools are wealthy, it's that the children who attend those schools are wealthy, and wealthier kids tend to have higher educational outcomes because of the fact that we have structural systems of class oppression. Okay, first argument. They say it aligns with progressive goals, and basically he's everyone left behind is worse off. So recognize that the people who leave are extremely successful though. The people who go to elite colleges in the status quo, oftentimes from poor communities, went to charter schools. The people who are able to go to college and the people who are able to reinvest only go to those colleges because they're able to go to things like charter schools that give them the tools to actually apply to college in the first place. You don't just funnel them through an education system and tell them that they don't deserve to go to college or shouldn't. And then he's well, the education you get at the charter schools is actually really bad. You might close schools. So the problem in the status quo is that we aren't able to close failing schools sometimes. Recognize that a huge problem is that we have to just continue funneling money into schools that are failing, that have teachers who don't give a shit about the kids, and we aren't actually able to create any sort of alternative viable solutions. The second argument is about how it's better for progressives. And he's well, no, the conservatives will just get credit for it. So I think you look actually much more bipartisan and much more modern when we're able to actually engage with the dialogue and discourse that the Republican Party has been pushing forward, instead of just rejecting it outright and going for a failing solution. The status quo is so shitty in terms of American education that literally almost anything would be better than what we're doing right now. I think charter schools provide just one avenue in which we can actually have a transformative impact on students' lives that we cannot currently because we don't allow them to actually escape. But also, he's that people will just that conservatives will not or that progressives will actually be really losing elections and losing elections at the local level. I just don't think the defining voting issue in most people's mind is whether or not a progressive supports charter schools, but I think it is whether or not progressives engage on the political spectrum with other parties. So what happens then is that they are viewed as not engaging in other political parties, when instead they just continue to kowtow to the needs of extreme left individuals. But also recognize, and the third argument we give you is it's better for students. And I don't think they actually give any response to this. Recognize okay, so this is really key. So we let wealthy students choose what schools they go to. We let wealthy students opt out of the public school system and attend private schools. The thing that is toxic is that we do not allow poorer students to do that within those schools. We trap poorer students in systems and give them no mechanism to meaningfully escape it. If we allow private schools, or we allow wealthy students to escape those systems, let poorer students do it too, because we recognize it's a terrible system and it hurts people who remain in it. I think American education has been toxically held up by just throwing money at the problem, because the problem is structural. The problem is not just money. It is far, far deeper. For these reasons, project proposed.
So I don't think Zoe everybody knows how public education funding works. So it is true that state funding and federal funding also goes to public schools. It may even be true that a lot of that funding goes to the poor schools. But public schools are funded mostly through local taxation. The problem is that reflects the kinds of inequalities that already exist rather than changing them, rather than mitigating them. It enforces the lines that already divide rich communities from poor communities. What we're advocating for is that if you were to campaign for something, if you were to expend your political will and money, that you should actually advocate for the reallocation of money so that most public schools funding happens at a state or federal level and therefore will be more equal overall. That necessarily results in one, more money for poor schools, but two, now there's an incentive to actually increase funding overall because everyone has an incentive to increase funding to education. It's not going to be an isolated political interest. We think this is one, palatable and possible, but two, also the only thing that you're going to be able to campaign for without lashback from one, your constituency, and two, powerful elements of your constituency that have the power to counteract the other things that are at play here. Namely, the big amount of money that actually is the deciding factor. Recognize that voters are disproportionately influenced by the amount of money that goes to elections. You have to have other kinds of interests and groups and organizations to counter this. Unions are powerful, whether you recognize, whether you believe that all the things that they do are good or not. Because you have to interact with them, because they're currently supporting you, you should actually use that efficacy to achieve policy that is one, better, but two, actually not going to harm your political efficacy in the long run. So what do we hear off base? I'm going to go off base now. We were like, okay, this is a toxic solution, dealt with that. They were like, why will this change? So we told you why this is actually going to change, why this is actually going to be better. But even if we weren't to change, we believe the kind of change on their side is one, even if in some cases possibly going to be good, going to harm the worst of the worst off, and not going to target perhaps the best of the relatively worst off. Then they were like, okay, well, your benefits are extremely long-term, so I've never heard a reason why overall long-term positive benefits are bad just because you're not Actually, that seems to be the entire point. But actually, then they say, what's going to happen is that, you shouldn't support unions, so recognize this is just a structural thing. They exist, you have to interact with them, you might as well use their power with you. Then they say, actually, Democrats won't hate you for this. In fact, Obama supported it. So recognize Democrats aren't a huge fan of Obama right now, and he actually isn't a huge fan of them a lot of the time either. He's not the indicating force. But we see instances where this actually has gotten a lot of flashback. When people recognize that this is going to be the public schools that are already excellent and that you can't shut down, fail because money is going to be leaving these schools, that's what's going to get the constituency that you actually have, the poor people, people who have an invested interest in this and government services. They're going to see that this is going to be incorrect. Example, Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, right? But also we tell you that actually what's going to be the case is that largely this is not going to be a thing that solves political problems for you. So bipartisanship does not win you elections because other people who already won, the party who has already supported this for a long time is going to attempt to take the credit away from you, and that's how they're going to paint the picture, because they have an incentive, one, to differentiate, but also if you don't differentiate, that's not going to appeal to the groups of people who are going to vote for you. In the case that this may appeal to a group of people, they're probably going to be more likely to support the people who've already supported this in the long term. But we also find that actually the people who supported you in the who have been a major part of the group that has supported you empirically in the past are not going to find this palatable or find this a meaningful tipping point. This is not going to garner union support. Second, we were like, charter schools are bad. So I think they just don't understand this. We were like, it takes money from public schools. They were like, it doesn't get burned, it goes somewhere else. Yes. So it goes away from public schools. That's the point. It goes to other schools, but these public schools are not going to be the ones that are shut down. But one, if they are shut down, that's really bad because these students have nowhere else to go. But two, given that they're not shutting down, it just means that there's going to be a flight of money from these schools, and they're going to exist, but they're going to be worse, and it's going to be worse particularly for the children who are left behind who have no meaningful way to opt into this choice. We should not offer the choice in the case that actually it makes limits the choices of other people and actually makes them worse off. Then they say that actually what's going to happen is that people will reinvest. So presumably they will also do this, but also over the long term when schools are actually changed and better. Then they say that actually charter schools can target specific groups. So one, this actually isolates them and probably is bad. But two, there are going to be members of these disadvantaged classes who are evenly distributed throughout society. Some of them will not be able to move for structural reasons that impede them, that actually don't apply to other members that may also be economically disadvantaged, but they can move. These members are going to be worse off. So if it were to be the case that it's important to have that like ESL or like psych services, it would be the case that it is not better to have these services concentrated for some students who can contract into them, but systematically much worse off for all the students who actually are worse off at actually counteracting these the situations that they're in already. This is going to be harming those who can least fend for themselves.
Okay.
Then they say what's going to happen is that, no, wealthy kids go to charter schools. So yes, wealthy kids also go to private schools. But in the selection of people that we're talking about, they're not homogenously badly off. Right? There are going to be some people who are better off, and some people who are worse off. There are going to be some people who are better off, more informed, maybe more inclined to do this. Maybe they're from like structurally better environments or cultures or whatever. We say, one, this is going to lead. But why is it also going to make this bad off? It's not just the students. We tell you the political incentives of the actors who are tied into these communities are now severed, and that these communities are now worse off because the best equipped amongst those who previously had interests that were aligned with them are actually now going to instead incentivize themselves and align them with other communities that are not worse off and also will have an incentive to disadvantage these. But also, we tell you that actually it is just not the case. They were like, look, like you can't close failing schools, and that's actually bad. So we were like, no, probably even if schools are failing or failing in certain specific ways, closing them is bad. But also, actually, just won't happen. But furthermore, actually, charter schools are also likely to do this. Charter schools are largely very experimental. Sometimes when they don't have the monetary incentive to open anymore, or when they don't meet like certain structural incentives, they just close, and this fucks over the people. Already changes the incentives, but also fucks over the kids who already contracted in that situation. This causes a lot of disruption, and also it disturbs a system that actually has provided relative stability. Then we tell you there's going to be market failure, and that actually it's just going to be the case that people won't make these decisions in perfectly rational ways, which is what is just systematically true, given that we impose like burdens on like market systems already, right? But they never handle this. We think this is them. That being said, going on this, they were like, look, this is like very in line with your progressive goals, and this is going to be very good. So even if it is, we tell you that the fact that it may be so doesn't matter, given that other people are more likely to get credit for it. But we also tell you, given that this is going to work less well, this is not going to be a thing that actually is going to promote better outcomes for you. But also, when it does fail, the people who are going to be more likely to criticize you are people from your own constituency. And that actually, it has failed in visible ways, and these are going to be examples used against you, especially by those who are politically opposed to you, because recognize even if you want to play the whole, like, we want to be bipartisan game, that's not the incentive of the other players in the game who have an incentive to crowd you out. We say this is not going to be better for progressives. They say but also, they say that actually what's going to happen is that this is going to be better for students. But we ask you, what are the students that are going to be better off for it? Because it's not going to be better off for everyone. Not everyone from this public school is going to move to the charter school. That's simply not their case. Public schools are still going to be present. They're the things that we should care about. They're the things that are going to be finally, in the end, worse off. For all of these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Remind the panel that the floor speaker should not affect your ultimate decision. In that sense, Doug, you guys have a floor speaker.
Oh God.
A 2-minute floor speaker.
There's one thing everyone agrees on. No child left behind is important. Doherty's approach. I'll win this round if I leave my fashion sense behind. Mechanics' approach. I'll win this round if I leave all of the children behind. But then there's an argument about getting credit for things. So the question of who gets credit for charter schools, whether it's the original creator in Reagan, mechanics very certain, it'll be Reagan. And they'll resurrect Reagan and exalt him. Oh wait, the Tea Party's already doing that. But Mechanic also thinks that he can still get credit for the difference principle, which he created on his own. So I think it's an interesting standard we have about credit in this round. But I think ultimately the credit has to go to side government. But let's talk about money. I think money is really important here. So there was a great argument that came out of UP about how unions will now support the Koch brothers. Oh wait, that's not a good argument. Then they decide that now, since that's probably not such a good way of winning, the winning strategy will probably be to take money from the kids who are rich in rich public schools and then give that to other people. That's how progressives are finally going to take the cake, by saying we should take the money from your children who need to learn and give it to other children who might be other races. Maybe not something that'll win. But then there's this question of, like, everyone's gotten this round. Newark is like, everyone's been totally wrong about how the Newark public schools work. So coming from New Jersey, if the money ever gets from Chris Christie to the public schools, here's what happens. What happens is we've got this Abbott program where we give the most funding to the poorest schools. Zoe's right. And everyone's got iPads. In fact, the Devils practice in the same arena that the Newark high school set up for their hockey players to play at. That means that they've got these iPads, and scores are going through the roof. Scores in Angry Birds, not scores on tests. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So Alex starts by asking the reasonable question: why don't we push for the things that Zoe admits are the things that actually change outcomes? Because Zoe's like, educational policy isn't it? It's the structural stuff. So Alex like, why doesn't the progressive movement push for busing? Why doesn't it push for equalized school funding? Why doesn't it push for these things? These guys respond by saying, but you'll never have the votes to get these things. So their like policy, like these guys' political avenue is basically saying, the progressives should abandon all the things they actually care about in order to win potentially more votes to push for policies they don't fucking care about. Like, it's just, I don't understand what this argument is. There are also other parts of the Democratic Party that can get those votes. Like, they chose a heavy burden for themselves by saying the progressives, you know, the ones who are knee-jerk response, hate privatizing anything. They should support privatization so they can get even more privatization, which we concede won't actually solve any of these harms. Like, what? But also their recipe for getting votes is hilarious. Because their recipe is, you should abandon a constituency that gives you millions of votes, constitutes the single largest voting bloc in almost every constituency, and fucking bankrolls your political party in exchange for, like, private corporations. Like, the Democrats have kind of been trying to do that, and it's been fucking terrible. The only reason we have a party is these unions. Their side of the house is like, yeah, you know the party that cares all about unions? They should get rid of unions. They should try to kill teachers' unions. I just, like, don't even understand that argument. But also, like, suppose that they do actually achieve their end. As the son of teachers, this one kind of hits home for me. Because, literally, who are the people who are going to advocate against the crazy-ass school boards who try to say, we need to teach people that the devil is responsible for science? Who does that on their side of the house? The charter schools, for whom those people are their major clients? Like, I don't understand, on their side of the house, who is advocating for progressive policies anymore. Right? Especially since, again, Zoe can see throughout the round, like, educational policies are so much less important than structural change. If that's true, if that's true, and I'm a rich charter school, how am I ever going to, am I the one who's going to say, yeah, no, send your kids to us. We're going to use that money to lobby so that we can bus other kids into your school and make it harder for you to get what you want. These guys just give incoherent arguments. Vote up.
Here.
Two ways we can win this round. First, is our political advocacy preferable to theirs? They're like, we're going to create change with charter schools. Presume it's good for this time being. I think there's something really interesting, which is that rich schools manage to do just fine without all these innovations from charter schools. And they're like, that's just because their parents are wealthy. I mean, partially because their parents are wealthy, also partially because teacher Sally doesn't have to teach 40 kids in her classroom and can instead teach 20 kids in her classroom because they had the money to hire another teacher, Susie. There is a fundamental problem on their side of the house when they strand shit tons of kids in academic environments that are fundamentally not conducive to learning. You want to talk about statistics? How about the statistical studies that have shown that large class sizes kill educational outcomes?
Yeah.
So,
Point of order. The argument that large class sizes kill educational outcomes is a new argument within the presence of the round.
you know, so,
The members of the panel will review the point of order.
cool. The fundamental problem is that 95% of funding is local. So they're like, yeah, but we're going to get some people who are like fucking the status quo out. So they're like, but there are so many people fucked over in the status quo, any change is preferable. You know all those people who are getting fucked over in the status quo? They're like, it's unelectable, couldn't change. That's your voting base. Like, the 60-80% of people in these horrible schools that will never escape and are they're going to vote for these changes that they say are so incredibly politically unpopular, they'll never get a voting base. Literally their own warrants defeat their case. Then you're like, you couldn't possibly advance this anywhere. It's like, I don't know, why don't you just do it in Vermont? Or like have Jerry Brown pass it in California. I hear that sometimes policies in the laboratory of democracy spill over to other states. I hear this happened pretty well for like sulfur regulation when the progressives pushed for that. That was pretty good. We don't have acid rain anymore. So, also, will they actually win any elections on their side of the house? Because that is a prerequisite to accessing their offense. So we gave you the cream standard on side op. We said cash rules everything around me. In a post-Citizens United world, money dominates elections. Here's an empirical, especially at the state level, where relative differences in money are crucially important. Here's a good warrant I gave you. The entirety of the North Carolina State Senate and State House that have been bought by the Koch brothers. So what do we get? We get union dollars. They're like, but unions are bad. Who cares? We want their money to pursue the vast majority of other progressive legislation, but also our advocacy. But also, I don't think they're bad. I just think they're scapegoats. And they're not going to support Democrats who fuck them and come out as anti-union candidates. So then they're like, Democrats actually like these charter schools. Look at Obama. How about you look at Rahm Emanuel, who did follow Obama and liked them too. He was supposed to cruise to re-election in Chicago after his only opponent dropped out because she had cancer. You know what then happened? He didn't win in the election. You know who the opponent was? The head of the teachers union. You know who voted for the heads of the teachers union en masse? A shit ton of Democrats and people in... Yeah?
I know this is an example, but it's one of those examples that's also an argument, and I'm calling this new.
So the example was used in LOC.
No, this example, the explicit outline of how this went.
The political incentives and how that plays out is new. You just said
Yeah,
Chicago
it's
was bad in LOC.
You just said Rahm Emanuel
To the
did this,
extent that
that.
my newness is talking that his opponent was the head of the teachers union, that is an example, which is permissible.
Members of the panel will rule on anything.
Then they're like, but we've got you, because we're going to look bipartisan. As if you want to strengthen the GOP and moderate Democrats. The key to getting progressives elected is not to look as much as possible not like progressives. The fundamental reason why you see gridlock in Congress is because everyone knows that bipartisanship just gives the other party who came up with the idea first credit, which is why they don't vote for each other's bills. But secondarily, are charter schools even good? Even if they're like, even if we didn't win that they're comparatively worse than our political advocacy. They're like, we help some people. Yeah, but you help a lot of people who don't have the following conditions. They don't have to work after school. They don't have parents who are unable to do the paperwork. They don't have the inability to travel long distances to get to charter schools. Those sound like the relatively better off poor on your side of the house that you're helping out. Given that you're a progressive, you should help the worst of the worst. It's kind of hard to see how you win this round. They're like, we can help those with like particular needs like ESL. We think it's much better if there are more money and more parents to push for things like that in the public school system. Because guarantee you some ESL kids will have parents who won't file that paperwork, won't get in the lottery, and won't get the benefits. So what do we get? They may get a little bit of innovation. I don't think it really matters. I think money is what matters. We get parents who only work one job instead of 3 jobs going to PTA meetings and maybe checking those teachers' unions a little bit. We get parents who work 1 job instead of 3 jobs calling their state legislator and maybe getting a little bit more state funding. That seems like a rather good thing compared to their side of the house. But also, I think that their side of the house fundamentally won't work. By and large, people are not going to be rationally incentivized to uproot themselves from their community, go to a completely different school that they have no historical tie to. These people are not like homo economicus, absolute rational maximizers. That means they leave a shit ton of people behind the schools who get screwed over to the lack of funding. I think they have radically misunderstood the fundamental nature of funding in the status quo, becoming lack and like dereliction and hauling out of the urban school system, and we are very passionate about this.
Here.
3 questions in this round. First is who gets more and better outcomes for students. I think it's very clear that charter schools allow simply for more choice for those individuals from the most marginalized communities within America today. That's clear and uncontested by side opposition within the round. So very clear is like, sure, some charter schools do function bad, some are great. What happens if they're bad? This one unaddressed for my PMC There's explicit measures of accountability, hence a charter, that the state can shut down that school or radically change the way that school functions if they are not achieving the goals of what the charter actually says at the beginning. On our side of the house, there is distinct accountability measures for charter schools when they fail to actually address the problems of educational inequality. That doesn't happen in an opposition world where charter schools are not funded and there are more public schools. Failing public schools has been a microcosm of the American system for half a century. What we say on our side of the house is that there is just simply no accountability when public schools fail to provide distinct and discrete educational outcomes for students. I'm sorry, my school district hasn't sent anyone to an Ivy League school for 20 odd years, and the one next to me sends 5 a year. I just don't think that's a function of people living on a certain side of the street being that much smarter or dumber than another. No, it's a function of the structural inequalities that exist that Stowe talks about within her speech. On our side of the house, charter schools actively fight against those structural inequalities, and when it's simply throwing money at the problem, just can't do it. There are lots of well-funded urban public schools within the United States that are not sending kids to elite universities. They're not getting kids the educational and occupational outcomes that are actively beneficial and more available for kids in other schools. Our side of the house just allows for more and better outcomes for students. You have more avenues that these charter schools can work. They can work to promote social justice. They can work to promote LGBTQ awareness and provide a safe space for those individuals. They can work to provide social justice curriculums that are massively important for a potential aspiring arts student that a traditional public school may have defunded those programs to the point where I can't even play an instrument or paint a painting in school if that's the route that I want to take. We say on our side of the house that private funding is actively important, and charter schools allow for an additional avenue of private funding. Mechanic says, well, if it's only 1 in every 4, 1 in every $5, that's matched for private funds. That's really important. A 20 to 25% increase in public education funding would massively overhaul the system and be a big difference. Whatever implementation Congress has tried to do over the last 20-odd years to fund the public education system even more. If you take that analysis, we win the round because we are now providing simply 20% more money into education, which actively does promote different outcomes that can be preferable. We also say on our side of the house is that funding is accountable and that progressives can be accountable to those groups that are currently funding it within the status quo. Groups like Sam Walton or Bill Gates that may have a specific paradigm or worldview that in a lot of instances does not align with progressive goals and progressive movements. On our side of the house, progressives can work with those individuals, and if they don't work with those individuals, they can oppose those individuals, promote alternative modes of charter schools and education with their own political support and money. So what's better for progressives? On our side of the house, we simply help those who are most marginalized. I'm sorry, teachers unions are not marginalized to the extent that young, low-income children are. They need that help now. They need that help within the next 5 or 6 odd years. If you're a middle school student in Chicago, for example, or else you don't get to go to a good school. You don't get the skills that are needed to increase your educational and occupational outcomes in the future. I'm sorry, that's just not the long-term progressive, the long-term instances of working with unions hasn't worked for progressives within the last 20 years. What we also say is that if you buy Mechanic's analysis that Republicans aren't going to vote for progressives if you implement this policy. Yeah, sure. What does that also mean? It also means that unions won't abandon the progressives and start just going over to the Republican side either way. This is only one instance that you might piss off the unions, but as a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, you're still the wing of the party that is actively working with union movements more, actively working for different educational solutions. We say you can do this through committee work. You can do this through advocacy channels that maybe aren't as public in some instances. You can do this within the halls of Congress. Speak to those representatives, speak to those individuals, and actively gain your ear in that debate where you're just shut out of the room in the status quo, where the Obama-file Democrats and the Republicans have coalesced together to create a supermajority on this issue where progressives are just simply not heard. On our side of the house, we just get more bipartisan working within Congress, which is great for progressives, when they can get a seat on committees, when they can get a seat in the room, and actively influence their voice into that discussion, being hey, funding the Ayn Rand Institute probably isn't something the federal government should put federal dollars to, for example. We say on our side of the house that what do the politics look like? Government says, what's really important? Redistribute wealth, get rid of the local school funding system and redistribute wealth, across states or national lines, whatever. Number one, that's a pipe dream. Number two, even if that pipe dream is achieved, if you get up as a progressive and say that, you will be marginalized even more in the political discourse. You will simply be seen as trying to exacerbate the tensions between the haves and the have-nots and inflaming that rhetoric to the point where you are not as politically attainable, where middle-class donors who do acknowledge the charter school movement within within the status quo are simply likely to abandon you. Like there are lots of Democrats who make lots of money in the status quo. Like then those are people who support your party. On our side of the house, the politics look like that you're working within the dominantly accepted outcomes. Like I'm sorry, back in the early 1980s, like sure, progressives should have opposed the shit out of this and maybe like implemented other educational solutions. We're not living in the early 1980s. We're living in 2015, and we say that it's just been true that the Bush administration has won. Like 2 Bushes have been able to push this educational spectrum through to the point where everyone accepts this as the dominant paradigm. We say you need to work within this paradigm to actively get more educational outcomes, to get more kids attending academies that allow for educational outcomes that are sustainable, rather than just throwing them into a system that has clearly failed them for a long period of time. We are proud of them.